All right. Hey, welcome back. This is episode 5 of the Epoch podcast. I'm your host, PerryThePig, and with me is my co-host,
Dread from Epic Builds.
That's not a bad intro out there. I kind of like
There
it.
you go.
We are getting
We're getting
raids all over the place here on Twitch, but remember, if you're watching us on YouTube or on Spotify or on any other podcast platform, be sure to leave a comment there, or even just drop by Twitch at twitch.tv/PerryThePig or /EpochBuilds_YT and let us know where you're watching this podcast and how you're enjoying it. Maybe there's something that's on your mind that we could talk about here as well. So, with that said, we are right smack in the middle of patch 085D, which means that we've had stability up the wazoo, more stability than we even know what to do with. We've had stability nerfed slightly, but it's still very fast. We have keys flowing. The keys have been rebalanced so that they're now dropping from bosses, so we're now able to do our endgame dungeon stuff. And the game's in a pretty good spot, but there's not too much new stuff going on right now, because a lot of those new unique items are still locked behind content that we're kind of having trouble getting to. So I guess before we jump into our big topic for today, we're going to talk about build strength and the different things that means to us. Before we talk about that, Dread, what have you been up to? What are you doing in Last Epoch these days?
The last thing that I have done since the last episode is I've been working on making Projectile Necromancer 2.0. It was a Projectile Necromancer is pretty much a build where you just play skeleton archers and mages, and you just try to puke out as many projectiles as possible to make up for the fact of the bad AI, or like, well, they're a lot better now, by the way, since the last time we played that, but the AI is like way better now. But you pretty much, the idea is you puke so many projectiles that you clear the whole screen and you move on, and that like makes your clear speed so much better with skeletons and stuff. And that build recently got a gigantic buff with the offhand called Lich's Scorn that allows you to pretty much just make cold minions. Like, to be honest, it's like just the cold minion item at this point. The reason why that build kind of suffered before that point was because after the Dreadshade nerfs, and since skeletons haven't really gotten touched since like empowered monoliths became a thing, they were kind of power crept out of the game, sort of say. They weren't changed in a way, and they just felt bad for empowered content because they weren't designed around that, because they had been in the game for multiple years now. So it's like they just weren't good enough for that. They just didn't have damage. And then as soon as they released that offhand, bam, now it's T4 drill viable, and I'm so happy with it. And other than that, I've been playing a lot of Slowromancer, which I won't talk about much because this is not a Slowromancer podcast. It's a Last Epoch one.
It's funny that you mentioned the Lich's Scorn. It kind of addresses one of those problems that happens with melee builds and bow builds from time to time in Last Epoch, where you finally get to have all of your damage as one type, so that you can take advantage of, percent increased cold damage or cold penetration or cold shred, instead of having split damage types. Instead of having like fizz and then like another 60% of my damage is cold over here.
Yeah, the only thing I have to say about Lich's Scorn that I have a problem with per se is the fact that like it kinda is now the only way of playing cold minions. Like if you want to play cold minions in any way, it's like the way to play them. And I also don't like the fact that it's locked to just Dreadshade builds. Like for instance, like I could very well see it being utilized in like a Stormcrow build if it just said cold pen per intelligence for your minions. That would be really good for Stormcrows and stuff like that. And also another thing is I don't like the fact that the whole archetype is locked behind like an offhand, but it's not that bad because it's kind of easy to get. Because like it's
what
a
is it
boss
about
drop.
like being like an offhand? Are you like contrasting that to using a shield instead, or what's your issue with it?
Oh, no. I mean, just in general, just having it exist to be the only way that you can play this. Like, for instance, like if I think of Cold Necromancer, like Cold Minion Necromancer, I think of that offhand because ideally it's the best way of playing it now. It's like there's no other way of playing it at this point. Like, it's the only way of dealing damage with the cold damaging. That's fine as long as we get like some that help with like fire damage, like we do with the Dragonfire Edict and stuff like that. And another reason why I like it is because I like these kind of uniques that don't really, like, they don't make a build come out of nowhere. Like, this didn't make Projectile Necromancer into a build, right? It just made it so that it had enough damage for Empowered. So it's kind of just like your one-stop shop of going from like when you get to empowered, you're like, okay, let me go farm my Lich's Scorn, and then now I can do empowered content. And if that's how they want to go ahead and fix the skills that don't work because they don't deal enough damage, I'm okay with that somewhat. It's kind of like the threshold jewel kind of thing in Path of
Mm-hmm.
Exile. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's funny that you bring up the threshold jewel. That was the first thing I was going to say as well. So threshold jewels in Path of Exile, like I guess for those of you who don't know, there was a long track record that I think Path of Exile's moved beyond this at this point, but for a while
Mostly.
there, they were like fixing old skills by introducing new cool threshold jewels that basically just added attacks to your build. Like you can't play Fireball unless you use Rolling Flames. You can't play Frostbolt unless you use two of this threshold jewel over here. So I think they moved away from that at this point, but for a long time it was an issue, and I didn't like that at all. So I guess one of my questions is, like, I've got a couple thousand hours in Path of Exile here. When normal skeleton archers get buffed, when they become modernized, is that going to become like the new OP build? Because we already have like mages, which are good. We have the offhand that's good, and it's kind of dragging archers along with it.
Uh, well, as long as wraiths don't get hit too hard, they're still going to be like the best build in terms of necromancer. So
Wraiths are
this
so
is just
messed
making it
up.
like, yeah, it's just. But the thing is, it's like the thing is now the build is just viable. Like the skeletons are just viable. But the thing as well is when they do rework them, they're probably going to have Lich's Scorn in mind. Like when they first made skeletons, they didn't have Lich's Scorn in mind. But now that if they go back and rework Lich's Scorn, I mean rework skeletons, they'll have Lich's Scorn in mind. So
I
that,
want to I want to say one more word on this topic before we move on to what we're actually talking about today. But you mentioned trying to use this new offhand, Lich's Scorn, as a primalist, maybe buffing up the cold damage from your crows or something, and having an item that's like maybe 70, maybe even 75, 80%, this is the primary use of this item, but then you can kind of backdoor this item into a different mastery, into this like weird build over here. I love that. When items can't be used in that way, I think it's a failure. So when you're pointing out Lich's Scorn, like you just take off the word Dreadshade and you say like cold damage per intelligence or cold penetration per intelligence. Awesome. I would like that change a lot.
Yeah, and it would more lead to the way of how we like set items to be, like we've been talking about how like they're powerful enough on their own, but then they become very interesting when they're combined, which I think this set does really well at, by the way. But the idea is you'd have the Infernal Shade cold damage per stay, but then of course the cold pen for minions just exists, and that would make it actually usable in a lot of different builds at that point.
Yeah, just pigeonholed a little bit less. Like I want to feel like my brain is big. I don't want you to tell me my brain is big. I want to figure it out myself. All right, so with that, we got a handful of topics that we want to talk about today. And so we said that this podcast is all about build strength, and there's a couple forum posts and Reddit posts which have been the inspiration for what we're talking about today. So the first big topic for us is AFK builds. And this is kind of a humorous post. I'm not sure if this is something that was meant in jest or whether this person was serious, but it got you and I talking. So we're talking about builds that play themselves.
Yeah, this Reddit post, I'm not actually reading this Reddit post, not because like don't get me wrong, the meme is funny and I'm gonna link it down in chat here. The post is funny, don't get me wrong. My thing is you see that it has like 69 comments, nice, but like a lot of these comments are really passionate about this topic, and I actually ended up making a video about this Reddit thread, and then I had to delete it because of like some editing issues. But I had a lot of comments, a lot of passionate comments about this topic. So even if you and I don't care about this, it seems like it's a lot of people care about this, and there's a few reasons for that.
So when we say AFK build, like what are we talking about? Are we saying like a minion build is an AFK build? Like I can walk away from the computer?
So AFK isn't necessarily like actually away from the computer or whatever, like people would think. It's more like builds that play themselves. So like for instance, like Path of Exile is a good example here because there's a lot of builds in Path of Exile that play like that. Like like the old kind of like BV builds where you like play like the Herald BV, try Herald BV. You could like play like RF before like you play like yeah, RF pretty much. Stuff that just works as you walk through the map. Like Aberrath's hooves is a perfect example. So Aberrath hooves in Path of Exile is a pair of boots that as you walk around, you deal like elemental damage. And you're able to proc that and like that will proc a bunch of other different things that will clear the map for you. So as you just move around in game, it will clear the content for you. And that's pretty much like the idea with an AFK build. A build where you don't have to actually use your skills. You just simply run from point A to point B and your build does everything for you. So you can like watch Netflix or you can like watch YouTube videos, hopefully mine, and like stuff like that. And that's not necessarily the kind of energy that Last Epoch and the developers are trying to manifest in Last Epoch, right? So it's a very like sensitive topic because it's like, well, at the same time, we want people to have player agency. We want them to be able to make their own builds and stuff. But at the same time, they don't want their vision of the game to be lost. And we've seen nerfs because of this,
Mm-hmm.
with like specifically the static orb nerf, you know, or like this build isn't strong, but it doesn't go with our ideology of the game, so we're gonna change it. And that was as close to like an AFK build, like Poison Lich as well as another reference, right?
So let's get some context here. What is let's talk about like maybe the most AFK build that we can reference so people know what we're talking about, and then like what's maybe like the least AFK build in last.
So the most AFK build we've ever had ever, Arborist season chat. It's a Poison Lich by Arborist. Pretty much the idea is you use your wandering spirits and they will go around and they will poison things and they'll appear near you. And they're pretty much like little minions, but they count towards your stats. It's really weird. But the idea is they shoot out little darts, they poison enemies, and as you move through the map, they'd kill things for you. So all you had to do was just worry about one keeping your Reaper form and your Judge Shade up, and walking through the map and maybe like shooting something that's like a single target or using your Spirit Plague or something like that. And that was a very strong build. Like it went all the way up to 1,000 corruption. It was really easy to play, and it was much faster than all of the other counterparts because you didn't have to spend forever hacking at a boss, or you didn't have to spend forever hacking at a like rare minion. Like they would just die because Wandering Spirits just did that much damage, and that's as close as we've gotten to an AFK build.
All right, so what's the most active build? What build out there requires like the most button clicking, the most kiting, you using all 5 of your skills as often as possible?
Erasing Strike, definitely. Wouldn't you say that Erasing Strike comes? So the idea with Erasing Strike is you get a lot of buffs. Mainly, you get to auto crit with your next Erasing Strike when you use Void Cleave, and then use your Void Cleave, use your Erasing Strike, and the benefit, the reward for doing so is like a really big hit with like screen wide clear, pretty much. But you do have to do a lot of button pushing. You kind of have to like dance around and not die while you're trying to set this up and stuff like that because standing still sucks. So all of that combined leads you to actually having a really active playstyle. But of course, it's rewarding, but it's definitely nothing like Poison Lich where you just mindlessly walk through the game and kill everything.
I feel like I'm treading on dangerous water of getting our entire podcast off topic. But if I bring up the word boss damage reduction, it really diminishes how good it feels to play like one big hit bonky builds with a bunch of setup. They
Oh
don't
yeah,
scale well in Last Epoch at all.
yeah. It's sad to like do a 3 million hit on the dummy and watch it like only chunk like a tenth of the boss's health because of
Yeah.
boss DR.
So we're not gonna go too much into it, but
Hmm.
we can talk about this later if you're willing to drop by the stream or maybe your stream as well. But basically, what happens in Last Epoch is bosses get damage reduction based on how much damage you're chunking them for. So a bunch of small hits tends to do more damage than one big hit. So it's not quite as rewarding as you might think it was.
And whether or not if it actually does more damage or not, the psychological part where you just spend all this time going like this one big hit, like this big punch, and it just hits like a noodle, or at least it looks like it hits like a noodle, and you're sad.
It's not quite as big as you want it to be. So let's talk about numlocking stuff. So we know a little bit from the developers in the past. They talked about numlocking to the developers. DHG represents a maybe like a design failure on their part, where if the most if the best strategy for any given skill is just to cast it on cooldown as often as possible, then you're not really making an important gameplay decision about that. So numlocking. So for me, I don't have numlock on my computer. When I say numlock, I'm just taking my finger and I'm holding down Q for the next couple hours. But basically, numlock is like, it's just like the old Diablo thing. Like you hit numlock, you use the skill, you take numlock off, and your character's auto-casting something for as long as you're at your PC. So where does numlocking fall into this?
Where does numlocking fall into this?
Yeah,
well,
for AFK builds.
Well, I mean, Poison Lich was that because you could numlock your Wandering Spirits and not care because the duration and the cooldown were the same. And as you cast your Wandering Spirits, they would overlap. So you just want to be casting it as much as possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they got rid of that by just making Wandering Spirits useless. But then, of course, they buffed it recently with like a hidden change, which I don't know if it was intentional or not, but I don't want to get into that because that's a whole different topic. And then, of course, Maelstrom is another good example of what they did to fix that. Was they removed the instant cast portion from it and then gave it kind of like an unleash system where you cast it, you cast like, a few extra ones per time, but you don't cast it all the time. And ended up feeling better than the instant cast version, which is
And
fun.
you're talking about like Unleash from Path of Exile, right?
Yeah, Unleashed from Path of Exile. So the idea is you sit for like a few seconds, you don't cast Maelstrom, and then you cast it, and then it casts it like 4 times for you.
Mm-hmm.
And that is definitely a good way of fixing the auto cast thing.
It kind of feels like the word recently. Like if you haven't cast it recently, you get like this extra buff from it. It's
pretty much
kind of similar to a topic of conversation that I've been skirting around for a while on my own, which is like channeling builds, and more specifically Warpath, which is Cyclone, which is Whirlwind, which is every game you've ever played, because everybody seems to put it in their games. So you have these buffs in Last Epoch that are like endurance while channeling, armor, like almost 1,000 armor, it's a ton, while channeling, all resistance while channeling, and like why would I put all resistance while channeling on my character, except if I'm going to channel all the time? And then you kind of get this mono-dimensional playstyle. And that's kind of like an AFK build, too.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Warpath can definitely be very close to that, or at least the old versions of Warpath. Warpath now is definitely not like that because of Volatile Reversal being such a integral part of it, sigils and all that. Warpath, it may look AFK, but it is a very active playstyle, especially if you're playing it with like Judgment or whatever, because keeping your buffs up is like mandatory to feeling good with it. So it's like you spend most of your time keeping your buffs up.
So I mentioned the recently thing that I like the change from Maelstrom. Like if you haven't cast it recently, you get to like multicast, like kind of Unleash from Path of Exile. I feel like just having the word recently in more places in Last Epoch might be a good idea. Like I would kind of like the idea of, if you started channeling recently, you get this buff. You get 1,000 armor. But if you're just holding down Warpath for the next 30 seconds, maybe that buff falls off over time.
Yeah. And that would definitely benefit builds that are a lot more active in that regard. Now, the reason why I even brought up this point was because there's actually kind of a controversial thing about it. I got a lot of comments about this because I didn't reference it in the video, and the fact that there are some people, that have, problems with their hands. They have arthritis. For thousands of hours of playing Last and Path of Exile have killed your hands. And some people don't want to have to click all those times to play a build. And that brings up the question, should the game developers cater towards the people that have problems with that, or do they want to keep their ideology of keeping the game active, right? And this is very soft eggshells like we're walking on, because it could very well accidentally be really bad. But at the same time, I got like 40 different comments of people telling me that like the reason why they like these auto, lazy builds because they're, arthritis or their RSI or whatever. And that's a very good question of like, should they cater towards that? Like, Because like that is a problem people have, especially in the ARPG genre. Like, I'm sure you know this, Perry. You've been playing Path of Exile for a long time before
It's
this.
why I don't play Path of Exile. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so but the thing is, if we go away from this auto mentality or whatever, right? Like this kind of build where it's kind of the lazy kind of build, like RF or whatever, then it kind of makes it worse for them. But what you just recently talked about, the recently thing with like Maelstrom doesn't cause you problems anymore because you just cast it every so often. You're not clicking like every second to like attack. You're just clicking every so often, and that helps a lot in that regard.
It's like a nice middle ground, right? Instead of clicking for every single monster I want to kill, like this is one click, this is one click, this is one click. I'm clicking once every 4 seconds, and like that damage is going to continue during that duration. Yeah, I don't mind that at all. I kind of like it. Someone in chat here live actually just said that they like having one autocast build one autocast skill in all of their builds, and I actually kind of agree with that. So having 5 skills altogether. So like, are you really gonna like right click and then QWER for every single monster, or like for every like you have a main damage skill, a movement skill, a defensive skill, a single target skill, and then like what else do you have, right? So I would like some kind of buff. I don't mind having something that is autocast, or having like one skill that I can numlock if I want to. So
Yeah, it's kind of like
better.
auras. It's kind of like
Yeah,
auras from PoE.
like
You just put on an aura.
it's better if I use Holy Aura as a paladin at the right moment, but it's really not that bad if I just numlock it. It's fine, even if it's suboptimal, and I'm willing to take that hit as a player. I kind of like that.
Yeah, and this actually brings up the point of like, well, how many skills do you think we actually should be using to actually play the build? And I think like 3 is a good amount. And then 4th is your movement skill, like the one you just move. And then your 5th is like maybe some kind of like big hitting skill or a utility skill. Now, the ideology right now, at least how Sentinel is set up, it seems like as though they want us to use like Vengeance or whatever a bunch, and then use this one big hit skill like Forge Strike or whatever, and that's like your finisher or whatever, something like that. And that's like supposed to be your 5th skill. That's supposed to be your single target skill or your big hitting skill, yada yada yada. And of course, like we were talking about earlier with the erasing strike thing, it's hard to make those skills actually do enough damage to be worth your time. So a lot of the time, people end up only building around one skill that does enough damage, and then 4 supporting skills. And the Ignite Lich that I just played, the Ignite Hungering Souls Lich, is a perfect example of what I'm talking about, because you have a clear skill. You have, of course, Infernal Shade is your clear skill. That's one skill. Then you have Hungering Souls. That's your single target skill. You can't use them both at the same time unless you're using, Death Seal, but whatever. And then you have your Lich, which is a movement skill, of course.
Reaper form, thank you very much.
Reaper form. And then you have Death Seal. And then your last skill is like Transplant, that's not on your bar because Hungering Souls. Wait, what is it again? Oh, no, no, no. You have zombies on your bar. That is your Infernal Shade. And you don't have Infernal Shade on your bar. And then you can have Transplant, so you have 2 movement skills instead of just 1. And I think that's the perfect example of a build that uses multiple skills to deal its damage that doesn't feel bad to play.
What about, I've got something else that I want to bring up, but what about Sorc builds? So when I play a Sorc build, I've got like Static Orb Lightning Blast, because that's the only Sorc build that I play. Then I have my movement skill, Teleport. I've got my defense, Flame Ward. That 5th skill, I think it needs more options, but I think that 5th skill is kind of in a good spot. You can use it for mana in case you get in a sticky situation. You can use Focus. You CC the enemies by using Snap Freeze. You can try to work Static into your build. You could you could technically use Arcane Ascendance if you like standing still. I wish there were more options there. I wish I weren't just choosing Focus every single time. But that 5th skill and how it's kind of flexible, I think that feeling is in a good spot. I like what that feels like.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that too. And that leads into like a lot of different skills having different ways of utilizing them. Like, for instance, you can use Maelstrom for utility or for single target. You never have that problem on Primalist because you have Maelstrom and Warcry and ice thorns, I guess, technically.
Well, actually, when I play a Spriggan build, I feel terrible because I never have any skills to spec into. Werebear gets Swipe for free. Werebear gets Warcry for free, and then Warcry gives you Maelstrom for free. When I play Spriggan, I feel like I've got 2 skills that I'm happy about, and 3 fluff skills that are just kind of filling in the garbage.
And I don't have a movement skill unless if I waste a ring slot.
All right, so let's move past that for just a moment. While we're still on the topic of AFK builds, maybe like Numlock builds, we're kind of talking about Minion builds too. What do you think about proc skills versus skills that you actively use? And the thing that's on my mind first, so that I can just let you figure out your response to this, I'm thinking about hammers and smite. Because hammers and smite, like, you get to use this as a sentinel, you like dash into a pack of enemies, all your smites go off instantly, and it feels really good, even though you're really only using one skill, that hammer skill. What do you think about proc skills?
I like them. I've been doing some research into Grim Dawn because I've been wanting to play it a bit, and that's pretty much what Grim Dawn is proc skill after proc skill, yada yada yada, like proc chains. And that's the same thing in Risk of Rain as well, if we're going to bring up proc chains, like where you have a skill that procs a skill that procs another skill, stuff like that. And I think how they currently have it is fine, as long as it's something like the Icicle Bow, like Rain of Winter, I think is a good example, where it's like you can't spec into the skill, but the skill does enough damage at base where you can scale it to do enough damage to use it. And the Dragon Song Bow is close to that. It just has a few problems in terms of just usability.
And targeting,
then, of course, yeah, the targeting. Like, if it just targeted like around you, like, it would be so fun. It would be fine. But then you have skills like that where you have Hammer Throw that's triggering another skill. Like, you have Hammer Throw triggering Smite, and that's where it starts getting a little crazy, because you have this skill tree with Hammer Throw, which has a lot of utility in it. It has crit, increased damage, and stuff like that. It shreds enemies, right? It gives you life on hit if you go spec into those nodes. Like, it has a lot of utility, and since you're not using it for damage, you can use that utility. And then you have Smite, which is your damage, and since you're not self-casting Smite and you don't have to take all the bad self-casting nodes and all that, you can focus on the damage nodes and make it do as much damage as humanly possible, i.e. through Devotion or through Void Knight Vitality scaling. And like, self-casting Smite sucks. Like, let's be real. Like, self-casting Smite sucks, right?
Self-casting Smite is probably an appropriate power level to the game, to be honest. Like, that's probably like about as much power as the player should have. But there are just like so many other things you can do instead.
Yeah, and the thing, mainly Smite is supposed to be your single target skill. Like, you're supposed to be like this caster, use Smite as your single target skill, and we kind of have that with the Devouring Orb, but there are better options, like you said, with like Abyssal Echoes and stuff like that. But the problem is, Paladin, or the spellcasting variety of Sentinel, doesn't have anything that's like an AoE. They have like the Sigils of Hope holy symbol thing where it like blows up, but that's bugged.
How dare you even bring that up? We're not going to talk about DPS Sigils of Hope on this stream. Get out of here.
But yeah, that's the problem, is like, Smite isn't supposed to be a clear skill, but then you turn it into one with hammers, right? Which is like insane, right?
Okay. So if we're talking about AFK builds and builds that only really click one button when they're doing their gameplay, is hammers an appropriate buttons to click ratio?
Yeah, I think it is, because not only do you have to keep up your sigils, use your reversal, use your holy aura, or if you're a void knight, you keep up your anomaly. You have a movement skill, you move around, and it's not like, oh, I attack once and then the whole screen dies or something. It's like I have to attack a bunch of times in a fast succession. Like, I walk up, it's kind of like BV if you didn't have Unleash. You just walk up to a pack, BV, bam, 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 and then it's gone by the time you get to the next pack, and then bam, 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 bam. I think that's fine. I think that's the appropriate amount of effort.
Yeah, we're not talking about like the strength of the skill. We're just talking about the buttons that you're clicking in a hammer, proc, smite situation. And yeah, I think I agree with you. You are clicking a lot of buttons, so I think that's fine.
Yeah, it's not like AFK by any like you can kind of like drone out and like not focus on the game and stuff
I
and
think you're
like
not
play it.
focusing because the build is strong, because
Well,
you're killing
yeah,
stuff. Yeah.
yeah. Like, but like with the hammer throw crit build, not the non-spirally version, you have to aim. You have to kind of aim and stuff like that. Like there is a lot of effort you have to put into actually playing the build. It's not just like, you click one button and then Wandering Spirits kills out everything on the screen. Like you have to actually click buttons. And I think that's the appropriate amount of investment you need to do with a character.
You have
If
to click buttons.
anything less than that is when it gets a little sketchy, right?
Okay. So I think we've said what we need to say about like AFK builds and kind of our thoughts on those. I do want to move on. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
So I've got my second topic here, and this is I guess this is really close to a topic that you and I have both played very recently, and it's kind of like Ignite builds, which are kind of strong and kind of very weak at the same time. So the question is, how about starter builds versus high investment builds? So if this podcast is going to be about build strength, how about builds that start out really strong as opposed to builds that are really fun and very strong, but they only get to that point once you have all this gear in place?
Uh, I think that Last Epoch is very close to making this work. The biggest problem I find is I actually talked about this when I was like playing Ghost Lore. It was nice to like because what happened with Ghost Lore is I chose a skill, right? I was given a few skills to start out with. I just chose that skill and I was able to scale it right into endgame, all the way from the start to the end if I wanted to, right? And Last Epoch, it could be said that doesn't really have that. Like it used to not have that really hard. Like when you played like Acolyte and you started out with Skeleton, and every Acolyte wanted to get rid of that skeleton as soon as possible and actually play a good skill. But now that you have the Lich's Scorn, it's not that bad. So that got removed. Like that's not a problem anymore. I'm trying to think of like a good example, like Vengeance, I guess, is a good example. Speaking of the devil who raided us, speaking of Vengeance. But Vengeance is a good example now of a skill that you used to be able to take from level one, invest into it all the way to literal like the tippy top of endgame, and that has been slowly whittled away to the point where it is now, where even if you want to play it, you're gonna have to like have a really large buy-in to make it even close to usable in a way that is fun. Because we play these games for fun, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a good example of like, should that be the case where builds aren't good until you invest into them? Should there be builds that just are strong enough to get through the first few parts of the game to like the mid end game and then kind of like teeter totter off like the skeletons, but then you can like buff into them more with Lich's Scorn? Like, should there be builds like that? Should there be builds that require a lot of investment to work and you don't get to play them until you get that investment? And then there's builds that you start out with no investment whatsoever. The skill kind of carries you a little bit, kind of like old Spirit Plague.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could play a different build that requires investment, right? Like
This kind of reminds me of something from like a different genre of game, and I'm gonna run this by you and see what you think about it. What are your thoughts on like weapon stability or like weapon durability in a game like Breath of the Wild, for example? So while you chew on that, weapon durability is like you need to like change the weapon that you're using if you want to continue dealing damage, right? So like you have a stick, you're gonna hit an enemy with it. Eventually the stick's gonna break, and you need to find something else to use instead. So it kind of feels like Vengeance in that same way, where like you have Vengeance at the beginning of the game, you're gonna use it until it falls off, and then you need to move on to something else. So there are people out there who don't like weapon durability systems in games like Breath of the Wild because it feels like they want to use that one legendary sword that they just found, but they're almost punished for using it because they're going to have to move on to something that they don't like as much. So should all skills be viable in endgame?
No. Like, I mean, there's always going to be that power struggle where like some skills are worse than others. Like, look at Infernal Shade. It was bad all the way up until like, to be honest, it's still kind of bad, but like it's good enough now to actually play. but it's still bad. So it's like, I don't think that every skill needs to be good. I just think that if you're going to give a player the first skill they play with, you gotta always think of the fact that they might want to just play that skill and that skill only till the end. So either it might be they might have to like change when you get skills. Like for instance, just give Sentinel Warpath as its first skill. It's like Warpath, you can play all the way through the campaign. It's a
Not
little
bad
slow.
idea. I kind of like it.
But you can play it all the way through anything, or Hammer Throw. That's another good example. You can play Hammer Throw all the way through the game and stuff like that. But then when you give them a skill like Vengeance that isn't going to be good until you invest into it later on, and it's like, well, but then it's like, well, you get given other skills. I'm like, yeah, but you got to remember, like, people are just going to play with that first stick they find in the first area and keep using said stick, you know?
I don't mind that recommendation at all. Making sure that the first skill that the player gets from the get-go of the game is something that has a base level high enough where they can get somewhere. Like, they have things they can spec into. They had avenues that they could farm, get experience for, gear toward, in order to make it playable later on.
Yeah, like Lightning Blast is a good example. That's a skill that like actually functions. It's just overshadowed by, the big cold glacier we have. But like you can level with Lightning Blast and it'd be fine. It wouldn't be the most fun thing to ever do, but it would still work. It's like leveling with Warpath. Leveling with Warpath isn't fun. It's a slog because you got to upgrade your weapon and you're doing very little damage as a Sentinel, and it feels kind of bad in the early game. But then as soon as you start unlocking those kind of different ways of playing it is like when it starts actually shining. And Lightning Blast is, of course, the same way. Like you can play Lightning Blast with the convergence, do a lot of single target damage, and then of course you have like the way where you get the self chain on yourself, get a lot of free crit chance and stuff. Like, there's ways of playing Lightning Blast other than convergence in the early game, and you can like play Lightning Blast, right? But then of course, like I said, with skeletons, that was bad up until the point they added Lich's Scorn, and now it's like, but then now like if you play warriors. Now you're kind of in the if you want to be like, oh, I want to play skeleton warriors, and then like you're in trouble again.
Or Death Knight is something that exists. What is that?
You can play Death Knights. So what you do is you play Death Knights with rogues with the poison weapon and play poison minions, but that's kind of a cop out, to be honest.
All right, fair enough. So I mentioned at the beginning of this topic. So this topic is starter builds versus high investment builds. And things that maybe don't feel good early on, but feel spectacular later on. I'm gonna toss in one of I think is one of your favorite builds, one of mine as well, which is Ignite Warpath. Ignite Warpath is not a good starter build. It's like it'll get there maybe, but it requires a lot of stuff. And every time that I think about building an Ignite Warpath character, I end up with a build planner, or even my character that I'm playing in game right now. It's like it's all legendary items. And it's all like 2 and 3 LP with insane affixes on them. And like, it's fine. It deals damage. It's good. It's not like the best build in the game, but I like the gearing process of it.
Yeah, it's Gucci Paladin. It's just like, you just use all the legendaries and now, bam, your build works now. And I think that's a perfect example of a build that like is absolute garbage until you actually invest into it, and then it starts to shine. Obviously it's carried by like the reversal stuff, but like that's every Sentinel build at this point. And I think it's fine. I like that specific kind of like investment because you can't really accidentally walk into that. You know what I mean? Like you can accidentally walk into like playing Skeleton Warriors and then uninstalling the game after you get to end game. You can't accidentally walk into playing Ignite Warpath because the uniques you need you don't get unless you get lucky or whatever, right? And maybe that's how they should go about things, where like the gearing should be kind of, like the gearing should be part of that decision process, where like that's what makes things viable. Like the gear should make the build viable, not the skill itself. And that's of course another topic as well.
It's like you're reading my notes. I want to probe that topic a little bit more. So I wrote down in my notes, I said, how much does percent damage matter on your gear in Last Epoch?
Percentage damage?
This
If
is
you're
a big topic. Go ahead.
If you're an Ignite build, it's very important.
Okay. Ignite builds are important because, first of all, it's not a particularly good ailment. When you're getting your gearing process up and running, you want to get as much elemental damage over time as possible. So normally you have this like 40 to 60% increased damage range for tier 5 affix on a piece of gear. And of course, if you for some reason put percent increased elemental damage, it's even lower than that for some reason. But then increased elemental damage over time, it's huge. It's like double and sometimes triple the value that you can get for other types of percent increased damage. And that way, yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Those numbers are big.
Yeah. Well, this is also just like to talk about a build that doesn't care about increased damage whatsoever that still exists, and that is Serpent Strike. Serpent Strike, or Surfin Strike, since everyone likes to say that I say it like that. Serpent Strike, it doesn't care about percentage damage because you care about attack speed and skilling the amount of stacks you get per second for all your dot, right? And that's a perfect example of a build that doesn't need gear. Like, you need gear in other ways, but you don't need percentage damage, right? And it allows you to build your character in a much different way. And is that better than like a build that requires percentage increased damage? I would say no, because you're playing Serpent Strike, because it's like it's fine because it's Serpent Strike, right? But let's pretend like for instance, let's say like a good build had that. Like let's say like Elemental Nova did that, right? Every single time you cast Elemental Nova recently or whatever, or you dealt damage with it. Let's just assume like Elemental Nova scales all of its increased damage just by being Elemental Nova. Would that be overpowered as all hell? Yes, it would be, because Elemental Nova also does your clear, also does all this. It's very strong, and that means that you could focus on other stuff on your sorcerer, and that's kind of the case with sorcerer because they're idols, but still, it's
a little OP. So it kind of reminds me of Spirit Plague. Before Spirit Plague was nerfed, it had 2 nodes that you could use for poison.
Example.
One was damage over time, one was poison. And they both said you gain percent increased damage if you cast this recently. And one of the big issues is it wasn't when you cast this. It was when you cast it or if it spreads to another enemy. And it can spread to multiple enemies at a time, even before it kills them. And you got thousands and thousands and thousands of percent increased damage without any effort at all. You just click one button and right?
And that's when the game starts breaking.
So, but Serpent Strike kind of does the same thing. It doesn't have the spreading mechanism to it. So you're actually right-clicking in order to get this damage increase, but it is percent increased damage over time and also percent increased poison damage for each attack that you've done in the past 4 seconds.
And the reason why it's bad in the terms of Spirit Plague and it's good, or like I like to think it's healthy in terms of Serpent Strike, is because it's not like you have to invest into attack speed, and attack speed's hard to get. Like, it's actually really hard to get. Like, if you actually look down and look at all the sources of attack speed in the game, it is very hard to actually get a lot of attack speed, especially if you're a build that does not utilize wing guards.
Yeah, because attack speed, cast speed, and like almost mana regeneration seem to be these things that you really just
only reason you get enough attack speed as a Serpent Strike build is because you're a Beastmaster. Beastmaster gets like 100 to 200% increased attack speed for free. If you're trying to play Serpent Strike on like Druid or something, a Swarmblade, it's god awful, right? So it's like the only reason it works is because of Beastmaster, because you get enough attack speed. So I think I'm fine with that in that regard, because instead of getting all this increased damage on your gear, you have to make sacrifices in other ways, i.e. getting an Exalted Spear with attack speed, getting an LP Wing Guards with attack speed, you know, literally using your entire mastery just to scale attack speed, right? Like, that's a big trade-off, in my opinion, versus like just putting increased damage on your gear, right? Like, that's pretty easy. Or attribute scaling and all that.
So and attribute scaling, I think there's so much that Last Epoch could do with attribute scaling. Anytime that there's something that attributes do instead of 4% increased damage, it's awesome. It's so
Minion builds are a good example of this. I talked about this at length in one of my videos recently about the minion health attribute scaling stuff. Attributes on minions are insane, because you get increased damage, you get base health, and you get the benefit of the actual attribute. So like you're triple dipping at that point. In the end, it's actually better to attribute stack than it is to just simply use increased damage. Like you don't use minion increased damage anymore. The only kinds of minion increased damage you use are like minion increased damage over time on your weapon or minion damage over time, right? You don't use it on your prefixes. You use attributes to increase health because your stormcrows keep dying, right? Like you don't run increased minion damage. Like there are not many builds that I know of late that actually go out of their way, that are competitive, mind you, that actually go out of their way to run just flat percentage increased damage on gear for minions. Like they don't do it because they don't need it because attributes are so strong.
I'm taking notes right now. So we got the Necromancer weekend that just started today, and I don't play.
Well, I mean,
builds.
If you're gonna play with,
I'm gonna build mine like that.
Yeah. If you're gonna build with like the offhand, yeah, you're definitely gonna want to run intelligence because instead of triple dipping, you're quadra dipping, and then you run like the rip blood thing, then you're quintuple dipping. So it's like, well, actually sextuple dipping because you get the 5% in the tree, and then you get the 4% on the implicit, right? So it's like that's a good example of why increased damage isn't as powerful, at least for minions. Now, for other builds, right? Where do we normally see increased damage? Like, what builds are good, and where do they get their increased damage?
I want to say rings, right?
Idols.
I'm so wrong. I'm thinking about weapons.
Yeah, idols. Like
so, like if I'm playing a crit build, I want like spell crit or like critical strike chance and crit multi. On my gloves, I want attack or cast speed. On my relic, maybe I get like plus levels of something. I was thinking like rings would
You're
be
not wrong though. Rings are a good place of getting increased damage as well because they're kind of like the last slots you fill out. But like idols as well, like you saw it with the Vengeance idols, the Vengeance Smite idols. You got all your increased damage from that. Or what's another good example of increased damage? Sorcerer. Sorcerer gets a large amount of its increased damage from its idols.
Sure, it's a lot of percent increased mana.
That's a lot of increased damage. You don't have to run that much increased damage on Sword because of that. And so builds that have increased damage outside of the gearing process generally tend to be good builds unless you're playing Surf and Strike. So it's like, and that's why that Spirit Plague thing was so strong, was because it was a good skill that had infinitely scaling percentage damage on it that didn't have to run increased damage on its gear.
So if we're talking about like starter builds versus high investment builds, are these builds that have everything built into them? Are they only good up until a point, or are those also the high investment builds?
Well, it's actually kind of a muddy, there's a lot because it's like the Surf and Strike build. Yeah, you can start a Surf and Strike. You can do it. Like it's good. And then of course it scales right into endgame because you play Beastmaster and you get all this attack speed. But like other like Spirit Plague just did itself. Like you could play Spirit Plague whatever, and that was like a good starter build because Spirit Plague did itself, right? And it was also really good at endgame, not because of Spirit Plague. Like Spirit Plague's great and all. It's like 500 corruption with like the intelligence stacking, but when you combine that with a skill that requires a lot of investment to get going, at least now anyways, Wandering Spirits, that's where that's where it starts getting a little muddied, per se.
Whenever I'm playing in these weekend tournaments, so these tournaments you start on Friday, they go 3 or 4 days, and I play them all in hardcore because I think hardcore in last Epoch is really fun. When I'm playing these characters, if I pick a good skill, I don't need to worry about my prefixes at all. I get like mana regeneration so that my build functions early on. But like I want my resistances, I want my endurance, I want my crit avoidance, I want my movement speed, I want those kinds of things to get the build functional. And if I pick a good skill, my build's gonna get to 500 waves in the arena, even if I don't have any percent increased damage scaling in my gear at all.
And I
see you not. Yeah. Go ahead.
And that's mainly because of how arena works, right? Because like in arena, like it doesn't matter how long your push lasts. It just matters that you don't die at the end of it, right? So damage isn't as important as just not dying because you can spend 5 minutes on that rare mob in the wave at 500 because you don't care. You as long as you don't die, you're happy. But in like the Monolith of Fate, for like feeling good, like actually feeling good about your build, right? You definitely want the damage because like you just want to blaze past things, right? And I think that's part of it as well. is just the mentality between like arena versus like monoliths. Because like when I play a monolith build, I get tanky enough to the point where I just don't instantly die when I get tapped. But then I go the rest of it into damage, and then I actually do build increased damage on my gear at that point because it's mandatory to start scaling. Because like most builds are, or at least mine, anyways, they gravitate towards around 400 increased damage. Like I don't know about you, Perry, but like that's about like where I stop. Unless it's a special case like Infernal Shade, where you just need as much increased damage as humanly possible to make the skill function, right?
Mm-hmm.
And increased damage is something you get on your tree. Like you just get it so sparingly that you don't actually need that much. And even if you need that much increased damage, you just build into that attribute and get the increased damage at the same time as you get the armor, the dodge flat, or the ward retention, or the mana, right? Like you just build into that attribute and then gain benefits from that attribute elsewhere. Like for instance, a perfect example is builds that use javelin on like the banner javelin. You
Oh, you
build
mean the
into
attunement skill?
attunement.
Sure.
Yeah, you build into attunement like manifest armor, right? You build into the banner, right? You build attunement for your manifest armor to not die, and then you get double that effect, and it's actually just straight up better than increased
Javelin
damage.
using Javelin using the banner as like a
Yeah.
fifth skill in my build. It's the kind of thing that really makes me think about Holy Aura on a Sentinel, I guess on a Paladin build, and then Volatile Reversal and Sigils as well. Like those skills are so generically strong and non-intrusive. They're very easy to use. They give like tons of utility and damage as well that you can't get in other places. That's the kind of thing that I guess for me, when I'm considering my characters as a Paladin, it pushes Javelin out. Javelin with banner should be a skill that I consider using more often because it does a lot of stuff for you. But like those other skills, maybe those could be tuned down so that I could even consider using a skill like that.
Yeah, why? Well, the thing is, why use javelin to gain let's say like 200% increased damage, right? Why use that when you could use sigils and gain 120 and then get armor cap too? And that's mainly why is because all the other places where you get all the other places where you get defenses and all that, they casually just give you damage too. Like sigils gives you damage and armor. Like I guess like reversal kind of gives you a little bit of defensive benefit because you can kind of like teleport away from boss hits and all that. But like the paladin tree, like you get 100% increased physical, lightning, and fire for just existing, right? Like unless you're a low life paladin, then then you have different problems.
You know that it kind of reminds me of Path of Exile as well. Or sorry, yeah. As long as we're talking about this, so one of the changes that happened toward the end of my playing Path of Exile was they took all the percent increased damage off of your ascendancy and then moved it in other places. So things like Trickster, for example, they used to get 50% increased damage, like 50% increased damage over time, just for speccing the skill itself, or just for being a Trickster. And then they took that off. So like everyone's like, oh no, it got nerfed. It's really like you need to build for these things instead of just getting them free. I wonder whether that kind of thing might happen in Last Epoch someday. Where instead of you become a paladin and you're just like, oh, here's 100% damage. Or like you become a necromancer, here's 50% damage. It's like, I didn't really do anything for this. You're just giving it to me.
Yeah, in most builds, at least, I don't know like your opinion on this, but like most builds I play, like they gravitate around the 400% increased damage. So like the 100% you get as like a paladin, that's close enough. Or then you use Holy Aura, that's another like 60% or whatever, or 100%. And then you use sigils, that's another 120. We're already 3/4 of the way of what I would call enough, right? So
I need to start keeping track of this. I've never thought about that 400 number before.
Yeah, well, that's just where all of my builds like if you take my builds and put them in planners, like all of them, they will all gravitate around that number because that is about when increased damage starts becoming, not good to run. Like you can like run other stuff. Now there are examples outside of this that, like for instance, you can easily get double that number, like with Void Knight. Void Knight's a perfect example of a class, like melee Void Knight, like or just Spellcaster Void Knight, I guess, because you can get increased Void damage idols on Echo. Like you get all of your increased damage from everywhere else other than your gear. So that gives you the special ability of being able to just slam as much strength and vitality and like
And
all of these good
defense, give me a
things.
Bastion of Honor in there too.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's like, yeah, I don't need to run increased damage on my stuff, so I can like run other stuff. And it's like, it's great.
And
But
your
at the same
mastery
time,
bonus with the echoes is
yeah,
basically 40% more damage.
yeah.
Yes. Yes. Every single day.
Now, the thing is, though, some builds require more than that 400% increase, and those builds are generally the builds that lack those more percentage damage modifiers, right? Like Infernal Shade, for reference, required a lot of increased damage just to be viable because of the fact that it didn't have that much base damage scaling, yada, yada, yada. It just felt meh, right? So you needed to make up for that by getting a bunch of increased damage, which Lich is a perfect example. It's literally the mastery where you literally get only damage, and that's all
so
you
much
get.
damage. Oh, sorry.
Like,
You said only damage. You also get armor and damage
I meant the
reduction
passive
and
tree. I meant the
overleech
passive
and
tree.
oh, we're
I
not
meant the
talking about
passive
Death
tree.
Seal.
I'm not
Okay.
about the passive tree, not like the skills. The skills themselves, I
Sure.
mean the passive tree, because like that's what we were talking about, the passive tree, right? Like Void Knight, well, passive tree and idols. Like for being an acolyte, you just get all of your damage in the tree as a lich.
Taken
And
care
that
of.
allows you to just ignore it on your gear and build other stuff.
Okay, so we're not going to talk about Death Seal. We'll leave that
I
for
mean,
different
Death
conversation.
Seal. Death Seal just makes the problem even worse because it not only gives you increased damage, it gives you more damage on top of that, which makes your increased damage modifiers better. Like, I don't know about you, like if you've seen like a Spirit Plague build from back in the day, like Poison Lich, they would get like thousands and thousands and thousands of increased damage, and it's just like at that point, it's so much overkill, it literally doesn't matter. Like building increased damage on your gear was completely worthless, and that's still the case with Lich specifically.
I love it. Man,
Because
the biggest
60%
problem
on
with
your
Death Seal
ring,
is just like it's so much fun to
yeah,
use too.
yeah. Well, I mean, they could keep it the way it is and just make it so it's not your only source of damage, like to make all these bad skills competitive. Like
I don't want to give them ideas. Okay, that's I don't. Please don't nerf that.
they
Seal. I
don't
love Death
need our
Seal.
ideas. They'll do it exactly how they did it, like they've been doing it. It's like fine.
I want to move on to another topic here.
Mhm.
So we talked about AFK builds and builds that kind of play themselves, numlocking stuff. We talked about starter builds and maybe like high investment builds, what feels good from the beginning, what's the floor, what's the ceiling, for how much damage you get. I kind of want to shift for just a moment here. I want to talk about something that's ongoing. It's one of the social media campaigns.
Rat City.
Rat City. So this is a social media campaign that's going on with EHG right now. We are on the beginning of the 3rd week of it, and this is the community designed unique item. So for each week, we've been voting on like what class we want the primary intent of this community design unique item to be, what item slot do we want it to be, and what do we want the theme to be. So in case you haven't been keeping track, we have got a post here in Twitch chat if you're watching live. But the first week we voted on Mage. I voted Primalist, but I was in the minority. For the second week, we voted on having a 2-handed spear. And then for the 3rd week, the question is, what do we want the lore, the theme around the item to be? And I don't want to brigade. I don't want to tell you how to cast your
That's
vote.
what we did last time, and we got spears at the top.
Okay, I do want to brigade. I think having a Rat City unique item would be just perfect. That's what I want in the game.
Well, now you can't make that complaint about like Rat City being so obscure and it's only one thing in the entire
We
game.
should have named
now
the
we have
podcast
2.
Rat City Radio. Oh no.
I mean, they said that they're just gonna call it the Lost Refuge, whatever,
No,
and
sure,
that's fine.
yeah.
As long as they have the flavor text be Rat City, that's all I care about.
Or maybe an allusion to rats somehow, or what they didn't want to be called, or
I mean, like, what are you gonna
something
do with a
nice.
spear, like a rat spear? Like, what are you gonna do? Like a rat kebab? Like, I don't know what you're gonna do. I feel bad for people who are gonna make that unique. Like, how are we gonna like fit this all in?
As a community, we can do it. We got it. So my question is, if we got a mage, a mage 2-handed spear themed around the Lost Refuge or Rat City, what are you thinking when it comes to community design uniques? What do you want to do with this? Don't say rat skewer. Don't say rat skewer.
Oh, I'm not gonna say that. No. Like, you can't actually do that because like Mage has very little support for minions. Now,
you could have
what
like
I want
some
to do,
fizz stuff, or maybe like some necrotic tie-in, maybe.
what I want to happen is, like the clones from Mage, like the clones, make it so
Okay, yeah,
that
from
it's a
teleport.
spear that has adaptive damage on it, and it makes it so that you like cast either lightning blast or fireball from your clones with a percentage chance, kind of like the thorn totems, but it would count as yours. It wouldn't count as the minions, right?
Ooh, okay, okay.
So it's
Something
like
that
the
ties
Lost
in with clones.
Refuge, those clones, and then they could reskin the clones, right? To like being like the Lost Refuge people because they're lost. And you're finding them by using teleport the clones, and they're the Lost Refuge. They're like in the lore is like the Lost Refuge got all shoved into this spear for some reason as like lost souls. And that's what you do. Like, and as you teleport, they come out and and then they cast abilities for you. Or at least when you cast like fireball or lightning blast, they cast it for you at like a 40% chance or whatever balance you like. And it would actually be really interesting because it allow you to play like, now it would be really OP with lightning blast, but you're also using a two-handed spear. So I think that it's okay for the fact that it would be OP with lightning blast and fireball because of the fact that you're using a spear, and maybe make it so that the spear doesn't have that much damage on it, so you're forced to use like an ailment build. You could do like frostbite lightning blast or like ignite fireball, and that would make it way more balanced than what it was. And since it's a weapon, you can like ignite chance on the suffix or shock chance or whatever else you can get for ailments.
You have taken this ball and ran so far with it. This it's like above and beyond award. Having the Rat City cloning item shooting your
And
stuff with the
call
what
the
a good
clones
idea. I love
when
it.
you hover over them, just call them rat guys or something. Rat clone.
You can give them names like like
Yeah.
your minions have like those flavorful names.
Yeah. And have one of them just called rat or something. Like a random one.
I
That'd be
will
great.
say my idea is not nearly as in depth as that. I wonder if you've thought about this ahead of time. But so whenever I've been thinking about this theory crafted, community unique item, I've been looking at base types. And the thing that appeals to me most for a two-handed spear is we have a spear that has it's got physical penetration and fire penetration. So Fizz Pen is hard to use if you're playing a mage build, or at least any kind of typical mage build, because I guess this mage sword stuff, it's all like elemental. There's no fizz, there's no necrotic, there's not really void damage support, anything like that. But you could make use of like a two-handed unique spear with like fire stuff. You could have fire conversion, fire static orb, fire lightning blast, fire something along those lines. And honestly, what I would like to do with this is something that I mentioned way back at the beginnings of this podcast when we were talking about Lich's Scorn. So you mentioned Lich's Scorn. You could take off the word Dread Shade from the last line of text and say you get cold penetration for your minions per point of intelligence. And that opens up this item to have like a back door to be used as a different class, maybe a Primos, maybe a Stormcrow thing. I hope that this community design unique item has a back door into being used somewhere else. And one place where I could see a two-handed spear with elemental and fire penetration, you could try, maybe, to use this on a Sentinel. So if I have any say in this, I would love to see like a two-handed spear with like fire damage or maybe Ellie dot on it. Something that has like some backdoor utilization as a Holy Trail javelin.
I mean, just make it so all your damage is converted to fire or something, and then like then you'd use it on Holy Trail. You'd use it on Holy Trail because like what Arborist is saying, like they would all be fire damage, and they can scale with fire damage, yada yada yada, and you don't have this.
And then you have your implicit
scaling.
With fire penetration. Done.
I guess you'd have to make your spells deal fire damage. That would be like turn all your adaptive damage into just fire damage or something like that. Like they'd have to like be really specific, or just make it so that it just has a bunch of flat fire on it, like flat spell damage, fire spell damage, and then you can force it like with like the Forbidden Night Swords.
The Forbidden Night Swords, of course, give you flat void damage to spells instead of adaptive.
And allow you to play those kind of things.
Yeah. We were actually talking recently about trying to use, what is it called? Frozen Ire, the one-handed unique scepter. And that thing has like a cold damage to spells implicit, and also cold damage to spells explicit. And even if you're not using a spell that has a cold tag on it, you can just put all of your put all of your flat damage as cold, and it's going to have like, 5 or 10% of its base type, but the majority is going to be cold because that's what you're putting onto it. So you could make like a cold damage devouring orb if you really wanted to. I don't mind it. I think there's stuff to be explored right
I like this comment on the forum post. It's for some reason I feel like these community votes are a bad idea. At this point, it just seems like everyone is troll voting.
What?
The Rat City one. He's
Daggers
referencing the
in
Rat
my
City.
heart. You think I'm trolling? Get out of here.
No. I think it's the Rat City one. It's like, oh, you didn't get what you wanted last time. We're just gonna troll and make it the Lost Refuge, Rat City, baby.
I don't want Tri-Elemental. We have a Tri-Elemental unique. It's like it's
just make that one good.
No.
Like just make that one good. And the amalgamation of different monster parts, that's not very magey, but like at the same time we have uniques that like break stereotypes. We already have a void mage item with the fire aura stuff. Fire aura just needs to become a skill again, like become a skill that's usable. Lagan unique, I'm like, I don't know.
Have one. We have a two-handed sword with adaptive damage on it.
Yeah, I guess. I've died. Oh, yeah, we have the sword, but then they would need to make. I mean, the sword has been used a few times, specifically with like the void cleave.
You can use it with ravaging aura, sure.
Yeah, but I don't know. Outside of that, like I do agree that it kind of sucks for like spellblades. So like that's a good example of like. Yeah, like all like that one specifically they could fix. Like the void one, like they just need to make fire auras into something usable again.
Like I said before, as long as this community design unique item, as long as it's something that is remotely usable and isn't just garbage, as long as it's not garbage that stays on the ground, as long as I'm not just vendoring it for 500 gold, if it has any use at all, awesome. I'll be impressed.
Like the thing is, as well as like. The thing I'm happy about, which I told you before we started, was the Osprix. They're at the bottom, and it confirms my belief that everyone hates Osprixes because they're such a pain in the butt in the Monolith of Fate. And I'm happy that they're getting dumpstered.
I don't want any new player thinking that Osprix are cool and unique. No, they're garbage.
They're dumped. I like the fact they just got completely dumped on because I hate them in Monoliths.
And we're a little bit over an hour at this point, but I want to sneak in one conversation topic. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, let's do one more thing real quick. So I saw a video go up very recently, like last 24 hours or so, and this is from somebody in the Last Epoch community. He's a community tester. He just put this thing up on YouTube, and it's kind of long. I'll admit I watched it at 1.75 speed. But
you watch everything though like that though.
I watch myself at 1 point. I don't want to listen to myself, but. All right, so this is a video that came up from Mcfluffin. This is Lonestar Mcfluffin, if you've seen him on Twitch or on YouTube. And he just put up a video recently. Thank you for linking that in chat. I appreciate it. This is a video talking about dungeons and his opinion of what dungeons have succeeded with and what they haven't succeeded with. So Mcfluffin, for context, he is a community tester. He's been doing this game for a long time, and he's given some feedback about the dungeons themselves and what they mean to him as someone who's been around basically since the very beginning. So have you watched this video, right?
Yeah, I've watched half of it. I wasn't able to watch the rest, but I got the general idea of it.
I've got like 2 or 3 things that I want to sneak in as we chat about this, because I think it's a really worthwhile video, and I would encourage you either on Spotify or on YouTube, if you're watching this in Twitch chat right now,
I'll make sure to link it on the video.
Yeah, pull that video up and watch it later. I think it's a good one for you. So what do you think about that video so far? What are your thoughts?
My thought of the video, I like most of it. The only thing that I have any kind of sort of like disagreement sort of say is in the video. He specifically stated that there's nothing like this in other in ARPGs, so he's going to compare them to like a dungeon MMO, like a dungeon in an MMORPG. But that's not technically the case, because like the dungeons, they're heavily influenced from the Labyrinth system from Path of Exile. Now, if you've played Path of Exile and you've played it enough, you hate Labyrinth. So maybe that's not a good thing. Maybe that's not, But what makes the Labyrinth fun to run in Path of Exile?
So debatably nothing, but I'm with you so far.
Wait, I've lab run before. I know I'm one of the few. The problem right now is in Labyrinth, Path of Exile, when you run the Labyrinth as a character, because every character has to run through it to get their ascendancy, right? Unless you're trolling. And you go through it, and it's kind of just a meh experience. It's not like hard, like not too hard. It's annoying if you die to a trap, kind of like our stuff, like stuff like that. But then when you make a build that is focused on farming the lab, like a speedy build or a super tanky build, a build that kills, uh, Izaro in like a second, and then like you just run through the labyrinth, then it becomes fun because you feel rewarded for building around this dungeon and dominating the dungeon. Like you feel powerful, like that's what we play RPGs for, and that's the point, right? You're supposed to make a build focused on farming the lab to make it feel good, and you make plenty of money. Like enchants, they make money. They're a very quick way of getting rich in Path of Exile. And the problem is we don't have that in Last Epoch, right? Like
We don't have
I'm
a way
not
to
far.
build around the mechanics, you mean?
Yeah, well, yeah, like well, I mean, they do like Jurla turning legendary items, yada yada yada, getting legendary items, and with like the Soulfire Bastion, like McFluffin stated in the video, you can get really good items from it if you really try hard enough. And then, of course, the Arbor dungeon, you can spend gold, and that's a whole different topic, which I'll get on later. But like, you're supposed to be making builds that farm these things. And the problem is there's no point in doing that right now because there's no trade. There's like, for instance, if I drop like this amazing 3 LP like foot of the mountain or peak of the mountain or whatever, right? If I'm not directly using it, it's trash out the window. It's like SSF PoE, It's like you drop like a Death's Rush, Death's Door, I think, the boots that make you immune to bleed, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you drop that in SSF and you're playing SSF and you're playing a build that can't use them, you just throw them out the door. But like if you're playing a lab runner and you drop a Death Storm, like ooh, GG, an extra X, or at least depending. I don't know how expensive they are. I know like back in the day, like
So you
whatever.
think that just having a multiplayer economy is going to solve some of the issues of like why you're going to run these things?
Because it's like, why are we running these dungeons over and over again to get loot, right?
Mm-hmm.
The problem is the loot that in those dungeons aren't necessarily what most people want, right? Because right now, if you're playing like, let's say you're playing a build that doesn't use any of the Jurla uniques at all for some reason, like you're not playing with it, yada, yada, yada. You have no reason to farm Jurla outside of getting the legendaries, which is fine. And you don't mind doing a T4 Jurla if you're anticipating to slam something to a legendary, right? It's actually an exciting experience, like the rush, like the anticipation of slamming that item, right? That's fine. The problem is outside of that, you have no reason to run them currently because like you can't just like I can't run T4 Jurla, get a bunch of stuff to sell it, and then buy things for my build. Mm-hmm. I can't do that right now. So there's no reason to farm it outside of that. And that's the problem is we don't have trade in any sort of way. We don't have way of offloading these good items. And that's the difference between the Labyrinth from Path of Exile and the dungeons from LE, which are pretty much the same system. If you look at it, it's literally the same feeling. It's like very, very close if you look into it more. And I don't have anyone to sell enchants for, like in Last Epoch. Like if I get like a really good item or enchant or whatever, I don't have anyone to sell it to. So the only reason I'm doing it is for myself. And in SSF, specifically for Path of Exile, you don't do Labyrinth, like unless if you need something from it, right?
You might run it like to get one helm enchant one time.
Well, no, it's gotten a lot better because they have like a choice of enchants now. Like you get like a choice of 4. It's way better. Like you can actually self-farm your own enchant now if you spend enough time. But the thing is, that doesn't exist in Last Epoch right now. You run the dungeons because you want like 3, like you want, it's the same thing as a boss in the monolith. It's the same exact thing. You do the boss for the unique and you just run it for that unique. And if I don't need a Vessel of Strife, like a 1 LP Vessel of Strife with the role I want, I'm not going to farm T4 Jurla. It's not going to be enjoyable for me to do it. But if the candy is there, like the candy in front of me, the carrot on the stick isn't in front of me, then of course it's going to feel like trash.
So you want to like hold off on making too much of a judgment on these things before multiplayer comes out. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think there are things that like he brings up in the video that should be talked about, specifically the obsession of placing doors everywhere. I think it's a good idea in the Jurla dungeon because you can press D and go through the door most of the time. Or, you could just, use a movement skill to get through it right now. Don't tell Ichi. But like in the other dungeons, like the Arbor dungeon, when you get stopped by a roadblock, that doesn't feel engaging. Like the difficulty of the dungeon is supposed to be the enemies you fight and how you have to be right on top of the enemy to kill them. And if they're in the darkness hitting you, you're gonna die, right? That's the difficulty.
I'm playing an action RPG. Like
Yeah.
any
This isn't Heist League,
Any tiny bit of disturbance from me killing monsters is enough. Like,
Yeah.
and it's like a tiny, like, oh, like this door is here, I'm gonna go this way instead. That's enough. That I don't need any more like complicated mechanics in my game than just that. Because really, just any little bit like that goes a long way.
Yeah. And I think that Soulfire Bastion specifically is a good example of how they do this. And I really like the Soulfire Bastion, but I can understand why a lot of people don't like the Soulfire Bastion because of the mechanic of the D pressing the button to, change your shield. And there are a lot of situations where that does suck. Like, for instance, you're getting attacked by a fire golem off the screen and you get attacked by the other one, like the mint green golem. Like, it's annoying. But what I've seen every single time anyone talks about the Soulfire Bastion, they never bring up the worst part of it, like, at all. So if you do not know this, Perry, I'm sure you do, but in the Soulfire Bastion dungeon, there is the mint green golems, the siege golems, right? And when they sit down, they do their attack, and they have the AoE. What if I told you they're not the only enemies with that AoE?
Go on.
You know the flying guys? Like the flying things that look like they come into minions, but they're necrotic?
Okay.
They have the same attack. They do. They can shoot up in the air, and then it's the same animation with like the circle. Now, if you're fighting the mint green golem, right, and you just see like when you kill the golem, and then you see like an extra AOE for no reason, it's because of those the winged fire guys. I can't remember their name, but that by far I think is the worst thing about the Soulfire Bastion, because you kill this mint green golem, right? Like, oh, you're good to go. Let me swap my shield. Let's go. And then you get nuked out of nowhere because of the little fire guy. Because not only are they hard to see on the background, like the mint green golem and the red golem, they're cool because they're big. You can see them. They hold their weight around, and you don't encounter a bunch of them, right? But then like the little guys, there's a lot of them. And you can't see them, and they do the same amount of damage as the big mint green golems.
So you want more visual clarity and like maybe like distinct visuals for each one.
Well, yeah, I just don't think it should have the mint green golem attack at all. Like, I think the mint green golem attack should be the mint green golem.
Fair enough. Listen, but before we close out on this, I wanna piggyback just a little bit. So you were mentioning that you don't like the comparison of dungeons in Last Epoch to Valside areas. You'd rather compare it to the Labyrinth of Fate in Path of Exile. And I want to piggyback just a tiny bit. So one of the complaints that Mcfluffin had is that you don't, you can't affect the reward of the dungeon by doing the dungeon. So you don't get extra uniques from Julra by killing things. Like the doors affect her, but like you don't get more, like the monsters you kill are the monsters you kill. And they don't affect the boss fight, and they don't affect the loot after the boss fight. So the Soulfire Bastion is the only exception to that, which is to say you want to kill as many monsters as possible in the dungeon so you get all the little currency so that you can gamble more with the Soulfire Gambler guy. So it's funny that you mentioned the comparison to the Labyrinth of Fate.
Because Labyrinth has
because you get gold
mechanic.
Keys, and that's a huge difference, right? You can beeline it through and get the bare minimum. And the bare minimum is your ascendancy. You get like 1 gold key at the very end if you skip the mechanics.
And your enchant.
And then you get your enchant, right? But if you want to, you can also get this box and 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 this box. Or you can just have the bare minimum through. So something about that feels like it would properly reward you for, killing monsters, I guess. It's this weird thing. Like, it's an action RPG. It's all about killing monsters.
Jurla is a lot less bad than the Arbor dungeon because, like, Jurla actually, like, you can actually farm a lot of good uniques in a Jurla zone if you can
farm a bunch of exalted items in the first floor and the second floor based on the.
But that doesn't matter for the boss. Like, the boss doesn't care if you do
that's it right there. Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe there should be more of a connection. Maybe the loot should be at the end. Maybe something could change there.
Well, maybe just make it so that the more, like, make it instead of making it where the mobs in the dungeon, they drop the exalt items. Just make it so instead the door says the more mobs you kill in this zone, make Jurla drop more exalted items.
It kind of feels like stability, doesn't it?
Yeah. And it's like, you know, like the Soulfire Bastion thing where you get, you know, yada, yada, yada. And the Arbor dungeon, like, we've talked about this at length, but really the biggest problem with the Arbor dungeon is the gold thing. And I think if you could just farm gold, or the more, like, something like that, I don't know. Like, for instance,
maybe like the more monsters you kill, the more doors you're allowed to open at the end. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, with the Arbor dungeon, you could just make it so that right before the end, like, to make the boss drop a bunch of gold and make that gold be variable based on what you kill before that, right? And then you get like a little bit of a surplus, you know, a little bit more. Obviously, you can't make it too OP, but make it so that, like, I can put an Arbor dungeon key in my thing, not have any gold, and leave the end with an actually halfway decent chest room instead of, like, you know, like, I'm doing this for no reason. Like, I might as well not even do the chest room.
I hear what you're saying. So I want to remind, like, I guess myself and also the people here who are watching live, anytime that we're talking about these kind of design issues that we have with, you know, Last Epoch or any other game, it's always very easy to look at a game that we're playing and point out things that we don't like. It's much more difficult to actually propose good solutions to it. Yeah. So it's fun to sit here and go back and forth about, like, maybe they do this, but, you know, giving feedback like this, it's the same kind of thing as, like, you know, I mean, I come from the corporate world and I used to work in, like, user experience. It's really easy to point at something and say, like, I don't like how this menu works. Like, I don't know what the right answer is. All I can tell you is that me as a user, something here doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like I'm being rewarded, doesn't feel like this is happening the right way. And we can brainstorm, we can go back and forth, but yeah, I don't know what the right answer is. All I know is something here doesn't work. And for the most part, I think Mcfluffin's video that we've been talking about for the last couple of minutes, I think it does a lot of good to highlight what issues we see right now.
Yeah. And, like, to be fair, in my opinion, I like the dungeons. Like, I actually like the dungeons. I know a lot of people don't like the dungeons. The problem with the dungeons, like I said before, like, my problem with the dungeons is, like, I don't just go and do the Soulfire Bastion every so often. I go do it when I need it. When I need, like, let's say I need an exalted belt for, like, my 2LP, like, you know, Viper Tail? Yeah, Viper Tail. Let's say I need an exalted belt for my 2LP Viper Tail, like a good one. I'm going to go farm Soulfire Bastion for that. And not many people get into that situation because right now, with Last Epoch, since there's no goal, like I said, in SFPW, you don't do the labyrinth just because you want to go do the labyrinth. You do the labyrinth because I need this enchant for my build, or, you know, yada, yada, yada. You don't just go do it and then open the chest. Those are just more of a side thing, right? And that's the problem with the dungeons is, like, if I do not need exalted belts, gloves, boots, or, like, I need, like, a multi-LP weapon and I'm trying to target farm it, or, like, if I don't need the Soulfire Bastion, then simply put, I don't need the Soulfire Bastion, so I'm going to completely ignore it. And then those keys just rack up my inventory. And then the Arbor is even worse than the Soulfire Bastion in that regard, because the Arbor just is completely worthless until you have the gold to use it. Right? And it's like, you just ignore it. I hear what you're
saying, yeah. As soon as you run out of gold, it's like, well, I guess I won't run this for a while.
Yeah, it's like, I'm just never going to touch it, and there's going to be like 60 Arbor keys in my inventory that I'm never going to get rid of because they don't actually cost anything.
Well, I think with that, we got, our first topic was AFK builds, numlocking stuff. We talked about starter builds versus high investment builds, and where the floor and ceiling are on building % increased damage. We talked about theory crafting for the new Rat City spear that we're hopefully going to get for the mage. And we talked also a little bit about dungeons and what we do and don't like, and specifically talking about Lonestar Mcfluffin's video that just went up on YouTube, which I'm going to encourage you to watch. And
I'm going to link in the video as well.
Yeah, I'm going to encourage you to like finish watching it because I know you didn't quite get to the entire thing.
Yeah.
So that's going to be it for our episode here. Reminder, this does go up on both Spotify and YouTube. So there'll be a separate YouTube playlist on Dread's YouTube channel. That'll be in chat. You can type in !podcast right now. And then on Spotify or wherever you're listening to podcasts, remember, if you are watching this on a podcast application, just leave a comment there. Let us know where you're watching this content, and we'll be sure to make sure that things are working the way they're supposed to. There's no technical issues for you. So with that said, that's been Epic Epoch episode number 5. Dread, thank you so much for joining me.
Of course, anytime.
And then for both of us here, have a good night. Thanks for being here.